Helen started off by saying how long she'd been working in data for policy. And as you know, underlying data science is artificial intelligence, AI. All right? I was actually brought up on a small farm in Cornwall, where the meaning of AI is something slightly different. Which is artificial insemination. I then arrived at university to study computer science, to hear them banding around the term AI. And as usual, I took a snap judgment. What the hell do they know about AI? I know far more about AI than they do. So I can stand here and claim that I've been working on data science or AI for well over 50 years. Okay, not going to talk about that today. We're used to lots of disruptive technologies coming along and causing havoc. I'm going to talk about, particularly today, about blockchain, which is the sort of latest disruptive technology, and specifically how we're going to try and use it for automating regulation. At the moment, the driving force for blockchain are the financial services industries, which are using the technology to try and automate a lot of the back office functions. I believe, though, that blockchain probably will have a far bigger impact on government, ultimately, than on the financial services industry. Oops, around a bit. Okay, something went wrong, but anyway. There are two parts of blockchain technology. The first one that's been disrupted is called distributed ledger, and it is essentially just a distributed database of records where each record is encrypted, uniquely identified, and chained to the next record. So it's somewhat secure. And the second thing is smart contracts, which is very interesting, where people are trying to encode legal contracts as computer programs to make them executable. Now, the interesting thing, although smart contracts has got probably a few years to go before it starts to become usable, distributed ledger is probably good to go, and we're starting to see a lot of examples of using this technology already. Now, the interesting thing about distributed ledger, and this is why I argue that it's absolutely a cornerstone for government, is it's very good for tying down or encoding things that we use every day, like intangibles, like coupons, vouchers, licenses, etc. Private records like wills, public records like land deeds, etc. So, bringing the technology in to automate the land registry, passports, building permits, etc. Probably we could do this in the next 2 years if we wanted to do it. So, as I said, that's good to go. The one that I'd like to talk about more is how we might use things like smart contract technology, if you talk to lawyers about smart contract technology, they say they're not smart and they're not contracts. However, when they give you their list of why they're not smart and what contracts, I pointed out that our university grants contract office ticks every box on the list. What it's good for is actually automating the more mundane transactions that are either legal or semi-legal. Where the potential is, you could actually code up laws and actually run verification on them maybe 10 years' time in the future. And that's why I say it's absolutely ideal. What we're trying to do is to look at automating compliance and regulation, particularly monitoring. And we're looking at this particularly for fintech companies, these new emerging companies where it's a bit like the Wild West, where the government wants to encourage innovation, but also wants to bring a semblance of order, trust, etc. Now, the first component is automated monitoring. For example, the FCA used to monitor about 25,000 medium to large size companies. They now have well over 50,000 companies. The latter half are individuals and very small companies, but they haven't had an increase in staff. They probably had a decrease in staff. So the only way they can do this is to actually scrape social media and then use things like sentiment analysis to look to see if the individuals or companies are misbehaving. The second one is automated reporting. What we're looking to do is to have compliance reports reported in some XML language, so you can read them, and then encode them as distributed ledger records, so you've tied them down, so you can't change them after the fact. And then we go to the third one, which is then to analyze those reports, those blockchain reports, using smart contract technology. Can we actually code up regulatory rules as computer programs and then have the computer programs crawl over these to see if they're actually working? The other nice thing, if you code up your regulatory rules as computer programs, so that you've got some verification and rigor in them, you can also simulate things. So actually, before you actually bring in laws and regulations, you should be able to actually run them as models to try and assess what the likely impact is. And finally, then there's the trying to tie it all together by doing monitoring. So we're not suggesting taking the humans out of the loop for enforcement or decision making. We're just trying to use the technology to tie things down and for the sort of grunt work. So the reason why this is important is that the government's belief is that financial compliance and regulation is becoming increasingly complex, burdensome, and ineffective. So although it is costing financial institutions huge amounts of money to do this increasing regulation, it's not in effect actually getting a better system because it's so complex. And I've given you some figures about the incredible costs in the United States in particular. The other thing is that the large companies are often regulated in multiple domains, which in far different ways. So the problem that we've got is that every government does something different, and it's all internationally laid down. So the only chance we've got to work on this technology is in a new area like these fintech companies, and that's why we're looking at these new areas. The nice thing is, for doing things like automating regulation, compliance and regulation, there are lots of actually nice technologies around, many of which Helen's talked about, like data scraping, natural language processing, sentiment analysis, etc., that can be employed. Should I go through this? Should I move on? Anyway, it's pretty, but it's not very informative, is it? Okay, the simple thing, the core of the distributed ledger technology is you take a record, you encrypt it, so it's very difficult to change, you give it a unique identifier, and you chain it to the next record. So it's like doing an audit trail of records. So any sort of government document is probably absolutely ideal technology. And then you distribute it so that it's actually quite difficult for somebody to actually change something, because all the other versions would say, actually, something's gone wrong here. So for something like land records and such like that, it's quite an obvious technology. And I promise the next time I'll come with a better diagram. Okay. This is an overview of what we're trying to do. Online monitoring to detect financial abuse, because there's an increasing number of individuals and small companies. Things are international. So, for example, in Cyprus, there's a lot of people selling dubious binary options and making rather interesting claims for them in different languages across the whole of the European Union. It's relatively straightforward to scrape all that information and try and work out, who's misbehaving. Automating reporting so that it becomes, easier to understand. You tie the records down. Encoding the rules so that it's easier for people to understand. And finally, pulling it together using analytics to actually try and spot where things are going wrong. So just to run through this, using fairly standard data science technologies for monitoring, automated reporting, which I've covered, regulatory policy, which is very interesting because in the future you might have laws encoded as computer programs, so they're going to be more rigorously specified, and then trying to pull it together finally. This is for John Crowcroft. I thought I'd put up some code for him, so I'll move on now. Okay. And here's a more complicated diagram of the first one, where you can see the monitoring, the regulation, the reporting, the regulation, and then trying to pull it all together using the technologies. And finally, I'll try and catch you up a bit of time. As I said, this is what they're starting to call government by algorithm, trying to tie things down with technology. Distributed ledger, we're already seeing this being used in the UK and other places for benefits payments and such like. So there's some nice little exemplars around. There's huge numbers of exemplars in other sectors, particularly in finance, where they're trying to use it to automate the back office. The interesting thing from a research point of view and long-term for government is the smart contract technology, where you're basically starting to look at codifying laws and statutes and all that can possibly bring. Hopefully caught some time up for you and showed you some Python.